The first opium shipments reached England from Bengal in 1683, carried in British East India Company tea clippers. Opium was brought to England as a test, an experiment, to see whether the common folk of England, the yeomen and the lower classes, could be induced into taking the drug. It was what we could call today test marketing of a new product. But the sturdy yeomen and the much derided lower classes were made of stern stuff, and the test marketing experiment was a total flop. The lower classes of British society firmly rejected opium smoking. The plutocrats and oligarchists in high society in London began casting about for a market that would not be so resistant, so unbending. They found such a market in China. In the papers I studied at the India office under the heading Miscellaneous Old Records, I found all the confirmation I could have wished for in proving that the opium trade in China really took off following the founding of the British East India Company-funded China Inland Mission, ostensibly a Christian missionary society, but in reality, the promotion, men and women, for the new product being introduced into the market, that new product being opium. This was later confirmed when I was given access to the papers of Sir George Birdwood in India office records. Soon after the China Inland Mission missionaries set out to give away their sample packages and show the coolies how to smoke opium, vast quantities of opium began to arrive in China. The Beatles could not have done a better job. In both cases, the trade was sanctioned by the British royal family, who openly supported the Beatles. Where the British East India Company had failed in England, it now succeeded beyond its wildest expectations in China, whose teeming millions of poor looked upon smoking opium as an escape from their life of misery. Opium dens began proliferating all across China, and in the big cities like Shanghai and Canton, hundreds of thousands of miserable Chinese found that a pipe of opium seemingly made life bearable. The British East India Company had a clear run for over 100 years before the Chinese government woke up to what was happening. It was only in 1729 that the first laws against opium smoking were passed. The 300 board members of BEIC did not like it one bit, and, never one to back down, the company was soon engaged in a running battle with the Chinese government. The BEIC had developed poppy seeds that brought the finest quality opium from the poppy fields of Benares and Bihar in the Ganges Basin in India, a country they fully controlled. This fetched top price, while the lower grades of opium from other areas of India were sold for less. Not about to lose their lucrative market, the British Crown engaged in running battles with Chinese forces and defeated them. In the same manner, the U.S. government is supposedly fighting a running battle against today's drug barons and, like the Chinese, are losing heavily. There is, however, one big difference. The Chinese government fought to win, whereas the United States government is under no compunction to win the battle, which explains why staff turnover in the Drug Enforcement Agency, DEA, is so high. Latterly, high-grade quality opium has come out of Pakistan via Makra on the desolate coastline of the country, from whence ships take the cargo to Dubai, where it is exchanged for gold. This is said to account in part for heroin being favored over cocaine today. The heroin trade is more discreet. There is no murder of prominent officials such as became an almost daily occurrence in Colombia. Pakistani opium does not sell for as much as Golden Triangle or Golden Crescent, Iranian opium. This has greatly spurred heroin production and sales, which threaten to overtake cocaine as the #1 seller. The vile opium trade was talked about in the upper-crust circles of English society for many years as the spoils of the empire. The tall tales of valor in the Khyber Pass covered a vast trade in opium. The British Army was stationed in the Khyber Pass to protect caravans carrying raw opium from being pillaged by hill tribesmen. Did the British royal family know this? They must have. What else would induce the Crown to keep an army in this region where there was nothing of much worth other than the lucrative opium trade? It was very expensive to keep men under arms in a faraway country. Her Majesty must have asked why these military units were there. Certainly not to play polo or billiards in the officers' mess. The BEIC was jealous of its monopoly in opium. would-be competitors received short shrift. In a noted trial in 1791, a certain Warren Hastings was put on charges that he helped a friend to get into the opium trade at the expense of the BEIC. The actual wording which I found in the records of the case housed in India office gives some insight into the vast opium trade. The charge is that Hastings has granted a contract for the provision of opium for 4 years to Stephen Sullivan, without advertising for the same, on terms glaringly obvious and wantonly profuse, for the purpose of creating an instant fortune for the said William Sullivan Esq. Emphasis added. As the BEIC British government held the monopoly in opium trading, the only people allowed to make instant fortunes were the nobility, the aristocracy, the plutocrats and oligarchical families of England, many of whose descendants sit on the Committee of 300, just as their forebears sat on the Council of 300 who ran the BEIC. Outsiders like Mr. Sullivan soon found themselves in trouble with the Crown if they were so bold as to try and help themselves get into the multi-billion-pound sterling opium business. The honorable men of the BEIC, with its list of 300 councillors, were members of all the famous gentlemen's clubs in London, and they were for the most part members of Parliament, while others, both in India and at home, were magistrates. Company passports were required to land in China. When a few busybodies arrived in China to investigate the British Crown's involvement in the lucrative trade, BEIC magistrates promptly revoked their passports, thus effectively denying them entry into China. Friction with the Chinese government was common. The Chinese had passed a law, the Yung Cheni Edict of 1729, forbidding the importation of opium, yet the BEIC managed to keep opium as an entry in the Chinese customs tariff books until 1753, the duty being 3 taels per chest of opium. Even when British Special Secret Service, the 007 of the day, saw to it that troublesome Chinese officials were bought off, and in cases where that was not possible, they were simply murdered. Every British monarch since 1729 has benefited immensely from the drug trade, and this holds good for the present occupant of the throne. Their ministers saw to it that wealth flowed into their family coffers. One such minister of Victoria's was Lord Palmerston. He clung obstinately to the belief that nothing should be allowed to stop Britain's opium trade with China. Palmerston's plan was to supply the Chinese government with enough opium to make individual members become greedy. Then the British would withhold supplies, and when the Chinese government was on its knees, supplies would be resumed, but at a much higher price, thus retaining a monopoly through the Chinese government itself. But the plan failed. The Chinese government responded by destroying large cargoes of opium stored in warehouses, and British merchants were required to sign individual agreements not to import any more opium into Canton. BEIC responded by sending scores of fully loaded opium-carrying ships to lie in the roads of Macau. Companies beholden to BEIC, rather than individuals, then sold these cargoes. Chinese Commissioner Lin said, "There is so much opium on board English vessels now lying in the roads of this place, Macau, which will never be returned to the country from which it came, and I shall not be surprised to hear of its being smuggled in under American colors." Lin's prophecy proved to be remarkably accurate. The opium wars against China were designed to put the Chinese in their place, as Lord Palmerston once said, and the British Army did that. There was simply no stopping the vast, lucrative trade which provided the British oligarchical feudal lords with untold billions, while leaving China with millions of opium addicts. In later years, the Chinese appealed to Britain for help with their immense problem and received it. Thereafter, respective Chinese governments realized the value in cooperating instead of fighting with Britain, and this held good during the bloody rule of Mao Zedong, so that today, as I have already mentioned, any quarrels that come about are only over the share of the opium trade each is entitled to. To advance to more modern history, the Chinese-British partnership was solidified by the Hong Kong Agreement, which established an equal partnership in the opium trade. This has proceeded smoothly, with an occasional ripple here and there, but while violence and death, robbery and murder marked the progression of the Colombian cocaine trade, no such baseness was allowed to disturb the heroin trade, which, as I said earlier, is once again coming into the ascendancy as we near the end of 1991. The major problem that arose in Sino-British relations during the past 60 years concerned China's demand for a larger slice of the opium heroin pie. This was settled when Britain agreed to hand Hong Kong over to full Chinese government control, which will come into effect in 1997. Other than that, the partners retain their former equal shares of the lucrative opium trade based in Hong Kong. The British oligarchical families of the Committee of 300, who were entrenched in Canton at the height of the opium trade, left their descendants in position. Look at a list of prominent British residents in China, and you will see the names of members of the Committee of 300 among them. The same holds good for Hong Kong. These plutocrats of a feudal era that they seek to return to the world control the gold and opium trade of which Hong Kong is the center. Burmese and Chinese opium poppy growers get paid in gold. They do not trust the U.S. paper dollar 100 bill. This explains the very large volume of gold trade in the Hong Kong exchange. The Golden Triangle is no longer the largest producer of opium. That dubious title has since 1987 been shared by the Golden Crescent, Iran, Pakistan, and Lebanon. These are the principal opium producers, although smaller quantities are once again coming out of Afghanistan and Turkey. The drug trade and more, especially the opium trade, could not function without the help of banks, as we shall demonstrate as we proceed. How do banks, with their great air of respectability, fit into the drug trade with all of its attendant filth? It is a very long and complicated story, which could be the subject of a book on its own. One way in which banks participate is by financing front companies importing the chemicals needed to process raw opium into heroin. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, with a branch office in London, is right in the middle of such trade through a company called Tejapaibul, which banks with Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank. What does this company do? It imports into Hong Kong most of the chemicals needed in the heroin refining process. It is also a major supplier of acetic anhydride for the Golden Crescent and the Golden Triangle, Pakistan, Turkey, and Lebanon. The actual financing for this trading is hived off to the Bangkok Metropolitan Bank. Thus, the secondary activities connected with processing opium, while not in the same category as the opium trade, nevertheless generates substantial income for banks. But the real income of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and indeed all banks in the region, is financing the actual opium trade. It took a lot of research on my part to link the price of gold to the price of opium. I used to tell anyone who would listen, if you want to know the price of gold, find out what the price of a pound or a kilo of opium is in Hong Kong. To my critics, I answered, take a look at what happened in 1977, a critical year for gold. The Bank of China shocked the gold pundits, and those clever forecasters who are to be found in great numbers in America, by suddenly and without warning, dumping 80 tons of gold on the market. That depressed the price of gold in a big hurry. All the experts could say was, we never knew China had that much gold, where could it have come from? It came from the gold which is paid to China in the Hong Kong gold market for large purchases of opium. The current policy of the Chinese government toward England is the same as it was in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Chinese economy, tied to the economy of Hong Kong, and I don't mean television sets, textiles, radios, watches, pirated cassette and videotapes, I mean opium, heroin, would take a terrible beating if it were not for the opium trade it shares with Britain. The BEIC is gone, but the descendants of the Council of 300 linger on in the membership of the Committee of 300. The oldest of the oligarchical British families, who were leaders in the opium trade for the past 200 years, are still in it today. Take the Mathesons, for instance. This noble family is one of the pillars of the opium trade. When things looked a bit shaky a few years ago, the Mathesons stepped in and gave China a loan of $300 million for real estate investment. Actually, it was billed as a joint venture between the People's Republic of China and the Matheson Bank. When researching India office papers of the 1700s, I came across the name of Matheson, and it kept on cropping up everywhere. London, Peking, Dubai, Hong Kong, wherever heroin and opium are mentioned. The problem with the drug trade is that it has become a threat to national sovereignty. Here is what the Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations said about this worldwide threat. The problem of drugs, boss, already ceased to be dealt with simply as one of public health or a social problem. It has turned into something far more serious and far-reaching, which affects our national sovereignty. A problem of national security because it strikes at the independence of a nation. Drugs, in all their manifestations of production, commercialization, and consumption, denaturalizes us by injuring our ethical, religious, and political life, our historic, economic, and republican values. This is precisely the way the Bank of International Settlements and the IMF are operating. Let me say without hesitation that both these banks are nothing more than bully boy clearinghouses for the drug trade. The BIS undermines any country that the IMF wants to sink by setting up ways and means for the easy outflow of flight capital. Nor does BIS recognize nor make any distinction when it comes down to what is flight capital and what is laundered drug money. The BIS operates on gangster lines. If a country will not submit to asset stripping by the IMF, then it says in effect, right, then we will break you by means of the huge cache of narco dollars we are holding. It is easy to understand why gold was demonetized and substituted with the paper dollar as the world's reserve currency. It is not as easy to blackmail a country holding gold reserves as it is one having its reserves in paper dollars. The IMF held a meeting in Hong Kong a few years ago which was attended by a colleague of mine, and he told me the seminar dealt with this very question. He informed me that the IMF agents told the meeting that they could literally cause a run on any country's currency using narco dollars, which would precipitate a flight of capital. Rainer Gut, a Credit Suisse delegate and member of the Committee of 300, said he foresaw a situation where national credit and national financing would be under one umbrella organization by the turn of the century. While Rainer Gut did not spell it out, everybody at the seminar knew exactly what he was talking about. From Colombia to Miami, from the Golden Triangle to the Golden Gate, from Hong Kong to New York, from Bogota to Frankfurt, the drug trade, and more especially the heroin trade, is big business, and it is run from the top down by some of the most untouchable families in the world, and each of those families have at least one member who is on the Committee of 300. It is not a street corner business, and it takes a great deal of money and expertise to keep it flowing smoothly. The machinery under control of the Committee of 300 ensures this. Such talents are not found on the street corners and subways of New York. To be sure, the pushers and peddlers are an integral part of the trade, but only as very small part, time salesmen. I say part-time because they are caught and rivalry gets some of them shot. But what does that matter? There are plenty of replacements available. No, it is not anything the Small Business Administration would be interested in. It is big business, a vast empire, this dirty drug business. Of necessity, it is operated from the top down in every single country in the world. It is, in fact, the largest single enterprise in the world today, transcending all others. That it is protected from the top down is borne out by the fact that, like international terrorism, it cannot be stamped out, which should indicate to a reasonable person that some of this biggest names in royal circles, the oligarchy, the plutocracy, are running it, even if it is done through intermediaries. The main countries involved in growing poppies and the cocoa bush are Burma, northern China, Afghanistan, Iran, Pakistan, Thailand, Lebanon, Turkey, Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia. Colombia does not grow the cocoa bush, but next to Bolivia is the main refiner of cocaine and the chief financial center of the cocaine trade, which, since General Noriega was kidnapped and imprisoned by President Bush, is being challenged by Panama for first place in money laundering and capital financing of the cocaine trade. The heroin trade is financed by Hong Kong banks, London banks, and some Middle East banks, such as the British Bank of the Middle East. Lebanon is fast becoming the Switzerland of the Middle East. Countries involved in the distribution and routing of heroin are Hong Kong, Turkey, Bulgaria, Italy, Monaco, France, Corsica and Marseille, Lebanon, and Pakistan. The United States is the largest consumer of narcotics, first place going to cocaine, which is being challenged by heroin. Western Europe and Southwest Asian countries are the biggest users of heroin. Iran has a huge heroin addict population, in excess of 2 million as of 1991. There is not a single government that does not know precisely what is going on with regard to the drug trade, but individual members holding powerful positions are taken, but by the Committee of 300 through its worldwide network of subsidiaries. If any government member is difficult, he or she is removed, as in the case of Pakistan's Ali Bhutto and Italy's Aldo Moro. No one is beyond the reach of this all-powerful committee, even though Malaysia has been successful in holding out up until now. Malaysia has the strictest anti-drug laws in the world. Possession of even small amounts is punishable by the death penalty. Like the Kintex company of Bulgaria, most smaller countries have a direct hand in these criminal enterprises. Kintex trucks regularly ferried heroin through Western Europe in its own fleet of trucks, bearing the EEC marker Triangle International Routier, TIR. Trucks bearing this marker and the EEC recognition number are not supposed to be stopped at customs border posts. TLR trucks are allowed to carry only perishable items. They are supposed to be inspected in the country from whence they originated, and documentation to this effect is supposed to be carried by each truck driver. Under international treaty obligations, this is what happens. Thus, Kintex trucks were able to load their cargoes of heroin and certify it as fresh fruit and vegetables, and then make their way through Western Europe, even entering high-security NATO bases in northern Italy. In this manner, Bulgaria became one of the principal countries through which heroin was routed. The only way to stop the huge amounts of heroin and cocaine presently finding their way to markets in Europe is to end the TIR system. That will never happen. The international treaty obligations I have just mentioned were set up by the Committee of 300, using its amazing networks and control mechanisms to facilitate passage of all manner of drugs to Western Europe. Forget perishable goods. A former DEA agent stationed in Italy told me, TIR = dope. Remember this the next time you read in the newspapers that a big haul of heroin was found in a false-bottom suitcase at Kennedy Airport, and some unlucky mule pays the price for his criminal activity. This kind of action is only small potatoes, sand in the eyes of the public, to make us think our government is really doing something about the drug menace. Take, for example, the French Connection, a Nixon program embarked upon without the knowledge and consent of the Committee of 300. The entire amount of opium heroin seized in that massive effort is somewhat less than 1/4 of what a single TIR truck carries. The Committee of 300 saw to it that Nixon paid a heavy price for a relatively small seizure of heroin. It was not the amount of heroin involved, but a matter of one whom they had helped up the ladder to the White House, believing that he could now do without their help and backing, and even go against direct orders from above. The mechanics of the heroin trade go like this. Wild Thai and Burmese hill tribesmen grow the opium poppy. At harvest time, the seed-bearing pod is cut with a razor or sharp knife. A resinous substance leaks through the cut and starts to congeal. This is raw opium. The crop of raw opium is made up into sticky, roundish balls. The tribesmen are paid in 1 kilo gold bars, known as 4/10 Ts, which are minted by Credit Suisse. These small bars are used only to pay the tribesmen. The normal weight gold bars are traded on the Hong Kong market by the big buyers of raw opium or partly processed heroin. The same methods are used to pay hill tribesmen in India, the Baluchis, who have been in this business since the days of the Mughals. The dope season, as it is called, sees a flood of gold traded on the Hong Kong market. Mexico has started producing relatively small amounts of heroin called Mexican brown, which is much in demand by the Hollywood crowd. Here again, the heroin trade is run by top government officials who have the military on their side. Some producers of Mexican brown are making $1 million a month by supplying their U.S. clients. On occasions when a few Mexican federal police are prodded into taking action against the heroin producers, they are taken out by military units who seem to appear as if from nowhere. Such an incident occurred in November 1991 at an isolated airstrip in Mexico's opium-producing region. Federal narcotics agents surrounded the strip and were about to arrest people who were in the act of loading heroin when a squad of soldiers arrived. The soldiers rounded up the federal narcotics police agents and systematically killed all of them. This action posed serious threat to Mexican President Goltarin, who is faced with loud demands for a full-scale investigation into the murders. Goltarin is over a barrel. He can't back off from calling for an inquiry, and neither can he afford to offend the military. It is the first such crack in the tight chain of command in Mexico that stretches all the way back to the Committee of 300. Raw opium from the Golden Triangle is pipelined to the Sicilian mafia and the French end of the business for refining in the laboratories that infest the French coastline from Marseille to Monte Carlo. Nowadays, Lebanon and Turkey are turning out increasing amounts of refined heroin, and a large number of laboratories have sprung up in these two countries in the past 4 years. Pakistan also has a number of laboratories, but it is not in the same league as France, for example. The route taken by the raw opium carriers of the Golden Crescent goes through Iran, Turkey, and Lebanon. When the Shah of Iran was in control of the country, he refused to allow the heroin trade to continue, and it was forcibly discontinued up until the time that he was dealt with by the Committee of 300. Raw opium from Turkey and Lebanon finds its way to Corsica, from where it is shipped to Monte Carlo with the connivance of the Grimaldi family. Pakistani laboratories, under the guise of military defense laboratories, are doing a bigger share of refining than they were 2 years ago, but the best refining is still done along the French Mediterranean coastline and in Turkey. Here again, banks play a vital role in financing these operations. Let us stop here for a moment. Are we to believe that with all the modern and vastly improved surveillance techniques, including satellite reconnaissance, available to law enforcement agencies in these countries, that this vile trade cannot be pinpointed and stopped? How is it that law enforcement agencies cannot go in and destroy these laboratories once they are discovered? If this is the case, and we still cannot interdict the heroin trade, then our anti-narcotics services ought to be known as the geriatrics and not drug enforcement agencies. Even a child could tell our alleged drug watchers what to do. Simply keep a check on all factories making acetic anhydride, the most essential chemical component needed by laboratories to refine heroin from raw opium. Then follow the trail. It is as simple as that. I am reminded of Peter Sellers in the Pink Panther series when I think of law enforcement efforts to locate heroin refining laboratories. Even someone as bumbling as the imaginary inspector would have had no trouble in following the route taken by acetic anhydride shipments to their final destination. Governments could make laws that would oblige manufacturers of acetic anhydride to keep scrupulous records showing who buys the chemical and for what purposes it is to be used. But do not hold your breath on this one. Remember dope. Big business, and big business is done by the oligarchical families of Europe and the United States Eastern liberal establishment. The drug business is not a mafia operation, nor one run by the Colombian cocaine cartels. The noble families of Britain and America's top people are not going to advertise their role in the shop windows. They always have a layer of front men to do the dirty work. Remember, British and American nobility never dirtied their hands in the China opium trade. The lords and ladies were much too clever for that, as were the American elite. The Delanos, Forbes, Appletons, Bacons, Boylstons, Perkins, Russells, Cunninghams, Shaws, Coolidges, Parkmans, Runawells, Cabots, and Codmans. By no means a complete list of families in America who grew immensely wealthy from the China opium trade. Since this is not a book about the drug trade, I cannot of necessity cover the subject in an in-depth manner, but its importance to the Committee of 300 must be emphasized. America is run not by 60 families but by 300 families, and England is run by 100 families, And as we shall see, these families are intertwined through marriage, companies, banks, not to mention ties to the black nobility, Freemasonry, the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and so on. These are the people who, through their surrogates, find ways to protect huge shipments of heroin from Hong Kong, Turkey, Iran, and Pakistan, and ensure they reach the marketplaces in the US and Western Europe with the minimum cost of doing business. Shipments of cocaine are sometimes interdicted and seized. That is mere window dressing. Oftentimes, the shipments seized belong to a new organization trying to break into the trade. Such competition is put out of business by informing the authorities exactly where it is going to enter the U.S. and who the owners are. The big stuff is never touched. Heroin is too expensive. It is worthy of note that U.S. Drug Enforcement Agency operatives are not allowed into Hong Kong. They cannot examine any ship's manifest before it leaves the port. One wonders why, if there is so much international cooperation going on, what the media likes to characterize as smashing the dope trade. Clearly, the trade routes for heroin are protected by a higher authority. In South America, apart from Mexico, cocaine is king. The production of cocaine is very simple, unlike heroin, and great fortunes are to be made by those willing to take risks for and on behalf of the higher-ups. As in the heroin trade, interlopers are not welcome and often finish up as casualties or victims of family feuds. In Colombia, the drug mafia is a closely knit family, but such has been the bad publicity generated by the M19 guerrilla attack on the Justice Building in Bogotá. M19 is the private army of the cocaine barons, and the murder of Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, a prominent prosecutor and a judge, that the higher authority had to rearrange matters in Colombia. Accordingly, the Ochoas of the Medellin cartel turned themselves in after being assured that they would not suffer any loss of fortune, harm of any kind, nor would they be extradited to the United States. A deal was struck that, provided they repatriated the bulk of their huge narco-dollar fortunes to Colombian banks, no punitive action would be taken against them. The Ochoas, Jorge, Fabio, and their top man, Pablo Escobar, would be held in private jails that resemble a luxury-class motel room and then be sentenced to a maximum term of 2 years, to be served in the same motel jail. This deal is ongoing. The Ochoas have also been guaranteed the right to continue to manage their business from their motel prison. But that does not mean that the cocaine trade has come to a screeching halt. On the contrary, it has simply been transferred to the second-string Cali cartel, and it is business as usual. For some strange reason, the Cali cartel, which is equal in size to the Medellin cartel, has been, at least up until now, largely ignored by the DEA. Cali differs from the Medellin cartel in that it is run by businessmen who eschew all forms of violence and never break agreements. Even more significant is that Cali does virtually no business in Florida. My source told me that the Cali cartel is run by shrewd businessmen, unlike any seen in the cocaine business. He believes that they were specially appointed, but does not know by whom. They never call attention to themselves, he said. They do not go around importing red Ferraris like Jorge Ochoa did, attracting immediate attention because it is forbidden to import such cars into Colombia. Cali cartel markets are in Los Angeles, New York, and Houston, which closely parallel the heroin markets. Cali has not shown any signs of moving into Florida. A former DEA operative who is a colleague of mine said recently, "These Cali people are sure smart. They are a different breed to the Ochoa brothers. They act like professional businessmen. They are now larger than the Medellin cartel, and I think we are going to see a lot more cocaine get into the United States than ever before." The kidnapping of Manuel Noriega will facilitate an easier flow through Panama of cocaine and money, what with so many banks there. So much for President George Bush's Operation Just Cause. All it did was make life a great deal easier for Nicolas Ardito Barletta, who used to be run by the Ochoa brothers, and who is fixing to front for the Cali cartel. Based on my experience with the heroin trade, I believe that the Committee of 300 has stepped in and taken over full control of the South American cocaine trade. There is no other explanation for the rise of the Cali cartel which is coupled with the kidnapping of Noriega. Did Bush take his orders from London regarding Noriega? There is every indication that he was literally pushed into invading Panama and kidnapping Noriega, who had become a serious impediment to trade in Panama, especially in the banking business.